Okay, we're live.
Right.
Welcome to Unit 5, everyone. I'm Dr. McClellan, and we are the Fabulous Five. We're missing Doc Wilcox tonight, who is away with his wife, who is home from visiting. She's in China a lot, so she's visiting, so they're having some time together. And it's just the rest of us here trying to talk you through Unit 5. So I guess I'll sort of start things off just with a little bit of a talk about triads and chords. A triad is there are terms in music theory that are actually descriptive of what they are, and there's others that are not. And I think triad is a good one because it describes the fact that there are three notes and they stack up and they create a chord, and they are notes that are held that occur at the same time. So maybe we'll start with just the first homework, and as always, let me jump over to Piazza to kind of see. We have 23 viewers, so as always, please ask us questions on Piazza. Type your questions, and maybe the rest of you guys could keep an eye on Piazza as I'm blabbing away, and interrupt me if there's a question, and then I'll turn it over to other people momentarily to kind of jump in as well. But let's maybe keep this focused on just how to do the assignments, and then if people have more general questions, that's completely fine. But sometimes it's just a matter, sometimes students understand the concepts just fine, and it's kind of a matter of like, how do I actually just do this? So I'm going to share my screen. Hang on one moment. Okay. I'm hearing a little bit of a funny feedback thing. I'm not sure if are you guys hearing that as well?
No.
Okay.
I am. I hear it.
It's not bad, but I don't know if there's any adjustments you can make. See if there's anything there.
Steve, could you try muting, maybe?
Okay.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, you feel free to mute yourselves as we go.
Maybe that's it.
Can everyone see the first homework? Okay. And students, if we're ever talking about something that we seem to be seeing and you don't see it, please type something on Piazza so we know, because we want to be able to know that you're actually able to follow along. So triads ID. This is just what it sounds like, and this is not about what key it's in or even what the name of the chord is. It's just what kind of chord is it. And this is definitely a case where the material is cumulative, meaning that if you understand, well, first of all, if you're really solid with note reading, and then more importantly and more immediately, if you're really solid with intervals, you're going to do great with this, because it's all, as you see, it's a very small print here, but it reminds you of what a triad is, and it's basically a combination of certain intervals. And the way I've always taught this when I've taught live classes is there's kind of a triage process you can go through if you're familiar with medical processes, where you try to get to the core of it as quickly as you can by ruling out possibilities. So with a chord, the first thing you can look at is the interval between the outside notes, the bottom note and the top note, which is always going to be a fifth if the chord is in root position. In other words, in this stacked thirds format where the notes are all on adjacent spaces or all on adjacent lines. And so if you look at the outside interval and you're just a total interval ninja, then you can tell that this is a perfect fifth. And that narrows down the possibilities. It rules out all diminished and all augmented triads, because the thing that major and minor triads have in common is that they have a perfect fifth on the outside. So that's what I mean by triage. You kind of narrow it down. Then you know it's one of those two. The next stage is you look at what's in between them, that inner note, the sandwich note, and you say, again, going to your intervals, what is, and here, usually the easiest and simplest is what's the bottom third. It's important to be aware of the top third as well, but the bottom third will identify the triad for you. So in this case, we have D to F sharp, and if you, maybe one way you might do this is, if you're not totally solid, is D to F natural would be a minor third. It's raised by a semitone, so it's a major third, major triad. So that's a process that you could go through with this. Anybody have other suggestions for this type of process or sort of ways of going about it?
Actually, I'll just may I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
One thing that we could have mentioned last week, but it didn't occur to me, is there are quick ways of telling perfect fifths. And the quickest way to tell a perfect fifth is to remember that a perfect fifth will always share the same accidental on the top and the bottom, with the exception of B and F. So, for example, if the bottom note is a flat, for it to be a perfect fifth, the top note has to be a flat also, unless the bottom note is a B flat and the top is an F. B and F are always the exceptions to all these things. So if you apply that onto chords, one of the things you can do is you can make some of these assumptions that Stephen was talking about when it comes to diminished and augmented as well. For example, there will never be a chord with a flat on the top that isn't diminished unless there's also a flat in the bottom. So if you look at a chord and you see a flat in the top and there isn't a corresponding flat in the bottom, it has to be diminished. If you look at a chord and you see that there's a sharp on the bottom, but there isn't a sharp on the top, that also has to be diminished. So you can use some of these quick shortcuts when you think about the perfect fifths to at least identify augmented and diminished, as long as you remember that B and F are always your exceptions. You can have a B flat and an F natural, or a B natural and an F sharp, and have it still be perfect. But for every other perfect fifth, the accidental on the bottom has to be the same as an accidental on the top. So I'm looking, well, actually, you guys can't see this. Can everyone see Stephen's desktop still?
You mean, I'm sharing my screen.
Okay, well.
So I just found one that I think fits what you're saying. There's a flat on the top right here. Are you seeing that? And then on the bottom there is not a flat, which I think fits what you're saying. If you see that, you know that it's not a perfect fifth.
Correct. So that has to be diminished. There's no other choice for that, because the flat on the top has made the interval smaller.
Right.
So diminished is your only choice.
It would be a perfect fifth, but the flat shrinks it down by 1. Yeah. That kind of thing can be really helpful, just those little ways of remembering things, and it can get you through a lot of headaches. So anything else people want to add, or should we keep going through some of the other homeworks?
Can I just add one quick thing to that?
Yeah.
We talked about how to do it if you're an interval ninja. If you're a ninja but with keys and scales, and you determine that you've got a perfect fifth, you can always look at that chord and say to yourself, if, for example, in letter A, where we have E, G sharp, B, well, is there a G sharp in the key of E major, or is there not one? If there's a G sharp in the key of E major, then you know that that chord has got to be a major chord, since that would be the first chord within the key of E major.
That's a great point, yeah. It's like, again, with it being cumulative like this, I think pretty much starting with, especially Unit 3, it starts to be really everything is building on everything else. So it's like you're getting into more detail, but it's all the same basic stuff. So if you understand keys, you can do chords, and if you understand scales, you can do intervals. So there's all these different angles to get in at it and understand it. It's all ultimately all one thing that you're studying. It's not like all these brand new topics. So yeah, great. Anything else, or should we?
Those are all really helpful ways to look at this. But I'm sure there are some people that are still going to be counting half steps. I think it's always good to just keep in mind starting from the lowest note. I mean, assuming you have a stack of thirds, which in later homework we'll have to consider. But in situations like this, and people have to just remember to start with the bottom note count their half steps to the middle note, and is it 3 or is it 4? And that gives you some indication. It's going to be minor or major or possibly diminished. And then counting up whether it's 6 or 7 half steps for the fifth. So whether it's a perfect fifth or diminished fifth. So all of these things can work. It just depends on how comfortable you are with any of those methods.
Yep, absolutely. So maybe let's move on. What Paul said made a good segue into triads in key. Maybe we should jump over there. Triads in score, let's skip that one because it's useful, but it's not one of the core topics, I would say. It's sort of expanding chords out into when they're spread out over many notes in a real piece. Yeah, so triads in the key is again just connecting them back to their context within the key, and again there's a pattern here. So what do I want to say? Anybody want to have things they want to say about this? I'm formulating my thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just going to say about this, a lot of people get confused whenever, at least when I've taught this concept of putting the chord into the context of a key. There's this sort of confusion and extra steps that the students are considering, and really, as long as there's no accidental added to the chord, all you really have to focus on is the bass note, the root note of the chord. So if the chord is inverted, you have to fix it, but in this case, these are all root position triads, right? So all you really have to do is look at that root note of the chord and what is that in the context of this key. So that first example there, right, the root note of that chord is a D. So what is D in the key of A? That's really all you're thinking about. There's no analysis unless you see a sharp or a flat accidental added to the chord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point that you can simplify this for yourself by it's really just about the root. The rest of the chord kind of doesn't matter, except that you have to know the quality of that chord, right, which is always consistent. And I don't want to spend too much time finding it, but let me just take a minute to find the chart, because in the lesson there's a chart, and it's one of these things you can just memorize to know that, for example, just jumping back, the D is the fourth note of the scale, and that therefore it's the 4 chord, and the 4 chord is always major in a major key. And if you just know that, then your work is done. Let me see if I can find that. Can you see my screen as I jump over to the lesson? Or it's in a different tab, so I don't know if... Oh, I can see that I can see it. Okay. So yeah, this is basically it right here. If you memorize this little series of M's with one D, that's going to get you very far in this unit. Big M, 2 little M's, 2 big M's, little M, D. You could just break it down even that much, and you'll just always know that the 4th chord is big M in a major key. It's a major chord. And then following from that, you get the Roman numerals, which I think are somewhere in here. And this chart to me is really important because it shows one of the coolest little tricks in music theory is using Roman numerals to put 2 pieces of information into one symbol. Roman numerals are able to show both the number of the chord and the quality wrapped up into one number. So it's not arbitrary. Sometimes I see students putting capital letters for in place of lowercase letters with Roman numerals. The capital and lowercase really matters in this case. So memorize. It's actually easiest just to memorize these Roman numerals. You'll see capital Roman numeral 4 all the time, and you'll see lowercase Roman numeral 2 all the time. They just become familiar friends if you do this enough. Anybody want to add to that?
Just one thing. I know there has been some confusion about the triad types in minor, especially the difference between subtonic and leading tone.
Yeah. Let me try to. I think that may be in this lesson. Keep talking, and I'll try to find it in the lesson.
Okay. So there are two versions of the 7th scale degree in minor, and there are two versions of the chord built on the 7th scale degree. The subtonic would be on the unaltered version of 7. I know one person Piazza called it the flat 7, but that's maybe not a good way to think about it because it's in the key signature, and sometimes it isn't necessarily flat. It could be natural. In G minor, for instance, it's an F natural. So the subtonic 7 is the version of the 7th scale degree that is not altered like you did in harmonic and melodic minor, and that is going to be a major chord, while the leading tone chord in minor is going to be built on the altered 7th step, and that is going to be diminished. So again, in the key of G minor, that would be your F sharp chord, your leading tone, rather than your F chord, which would be your subtonic.
Yeah, this is a case where if that difference between leading tone and subtonic, I know trips people up, and if you are the slightest bit uncertain about it, from going back to Unit 3, go back and review and get really solid because it's going to come up a lot in Units 5 and 6 also. You're going to really need to be crystal clear on that distinction and how it affects, and then how it affects these chords. Because it affects the chords in two ways, as was just mentioned. When the 7th note of the scale is the 3rd of a 5 chord, certain things happen, and then also when it's the root of a 7 chord, those two things can be kind of tricky. So beware and get solid on that. And a note about. Well, okay, no, never mind. That's coming up a little later. I was going to say something about 7th chords, but anything else about this before I'm sort of keeping the clock in mind, just keeping things moving, but I don't want to skip anything either, so. I'm not seeing any questions yet. We like to get questions because then we know that we're actually addressing things that you guys actually want to know instead of what we imagine that you want to know. Okay, so anybody else? Should we go on to, probably inversion is a big topic, right? Why don't we jump to the triad inversion homework? And again, this is a case where if you are solid on interval inversion, you're going to get this. There's still another layer to add to what you know, but if you are good with interval inversion, you can do triad inversion.
It's also good if you can count.
Yes.
If you can count to 6, 5, 4, and 3, then you can do inversions.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good place to start, actually. Maybe we could explain it that way, based on the figured bass. Is that what you're thinking about?
Correct.
Yeah. Oh well, since I'm on this screen, bass versus root. This is really important, and Doc Wilcox found this really excellent graphic to remind you that a bass is not a root. They look completely different, don't they? And that distinction is really easy to forget, and well, it's difficult to understand in the first place, and then even when you understand it, it's one of those things you can completely get it, and then you're in the middle of a homework and you just forget that the bottom note is not automatically the root of the chord. It is sometimes and not other times. If you aren't quite sure what I'm talking about, read this lesson again and watch the review video again because it's really, really crucial. But let's jump right in on figured bass because in a way, where is it? Yeah, okay, so in a way figured bass is a more kind of, as you can see, it's not right at the top of this lesson, but in a way it's the simplest thing of all about inversions. It's kind of, it seems complicated, but it's actually a simplification of studying inversions because all it does is it tells you what the intervals are above the lowest note. It's very literal, and the intervals are stacked up in the order in which they appear. So the bottom interval above the bass is the bottom number, and the top interval above the bass is the top number. This is kind of small, but you can see that right here. A root position chord is a third and then a fifth. That's all It's incredibly simple. And that expands out to any octave. So even though these look kind of more complicated, these are all just root position, thirds and fifths above the bass. If you can remember that first inversion is 6/3, then again you're on solid ground because it's just a third and then a sixth above the bass, and that's all it is. Anybody want to add? I feel like there's probably a better way to explain this, but just trying to be very basic about it.
Hey, Robinson, maybe actually show this in a homework, like show them how to count it in one of the homework assignments?
Yes, good idea. So, yes. Here we are in homework triad inversion homework number 1. So it's going to ask you for the inversion in the form of one of these numbers, 6/3, 5/3, 6/3, or 6/4. This is also something you can do kind of visually, but this is really easy if you can count intervals, and not even interval qualities for that stage of this. All you need is the numbers. So this first one, the bottom note is your root. It may or may not be the bass, and it's probably not in this case, but the point is it's the root, and these little numbers, all they do is they show you the intervals above the root. So we have a third and then a sixth, and that's a 6/3. Here we have a fourth and then a sixth, 6/4. Third and then a sixth, 6/3, and so on. It's very simple. Then, as a matter of memorization, I think the easiest way is just to remember 6/3 is first inversion, 6/4 is second inversion. And as you get used to it, that'll become more and more familiar. But that's pretty much how you do this homework. Now, the tricky thing about this is getting the quality, because you have to kind of reverse engineer the chord to get to its quality. In other words, you have to uninvert it to figure out what the root actually is. And this can take a little bit of doing, but I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. Basically, just fiddle around with the notes, and this is where a pencil and paper is really handy. Move the notes up or down an octave until you get the notes into that neat stacked thirds position, which is also, now you know, you can call it 5/3. So in this case, if I moved, just trial and error, this first one, if I move the B flat up an octave, I still have a fourth between the D and the G, so that's not quite there. What if I move the G down an octave? If you imagine it on this second line of the staff, I'm going to have third, and that is what you want. And then you know that the G is the root, the root. And then you know that there's a perfect fifth from G to D, and the minor third from G to B flat, and therefore it's a minor chord in, again, 6/3 position, which is first inversion. So if you can do all of that, you'll be fine with this homework. Anything to add?
I actually have one other way that you can find the root in the inversions. Let me just switch over to show my screen. Okay, can you see my example? When I'm looking at these, what I tend to do is I tend to look at shape more than anything else. So you can see that we have, there are no root position chords, but if there were root position chords here, you would see that root position chords always are on all lines or on all spaces. So you'll see line, 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 space, space, root position. That means first inversion, second inversion always have a gap someplace. You can see in this first one between the D and the G, there's a little bit of a gap between those top two notes. And here between the D and the A, there's a little gap there. When the gap's on the top, it's first inversion. When the gap's on the bottom, it's second inversion. And if there is no gap, if it's even, then it's root position, minor, minor, space, space, space. And the other thing you can do is to find the root. The root is always the note on top of the gap. So here the root is going to be G because here's the space, and there's the G. Here the root will be D because our space is down here, and then there's the D. And if there is no gap, if it's just line on line or space, 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 then the root would be the one on the bottom. So that's sort of a way of looking at this by shape and by recognizing the pattern and looking for where the gaps are, which sometimes works well. The downside of this, it certainly doesn't help you find the quality, but it can be at least one way of getting the root fairly quickly.
Yeah, especially if you're a visual kind of person, it's definitely the quickest way. If you just memorize that look of it, you can recognize the inversion almost immediately, and then work from there, which can be great. Yeah, so let's see. Should we jump over to seventh chords, or just let's take a quick look at triad inversion 2. Make sure that we're covering that, because inversions can be a little bit of a brain teaser. Yeah, so when you expand the music out into 4 voices and you have notes doubled, now this is going to set you up well for Unit 6. So again, we're building new things in that are going to come back later. So a pencil and paper in this one is really going to be great, because if you can reduce the chord that you see down to those 3 notes, you're going to be in good stead. And just one warning about this that could trip you up, given what we were just talking about. If you notice on the top staff, we have these nice little triads the way we're used to seeing them with 3 notes, and we can recognize the gap, and we can recognize where the root is and the inversion. But don't let that mislead you, because the bottom note of the chords on that top staff are not actually the root, because there's this bass line down here, and you have to think of these chords in a grand staff. Going back to Unit 1, we learned about the grand staff, and even though there are 2 staves, the students sometimes get mixed up about this. It is all one musical entity, top to bottom, stacked up. They're not 2 separate things. This is one big chord. So the way you could think of it is that the note in the bass clef trumps the bottom note of the treble clef when you're determining the bass note, not the root, but the bass. So just that we won't go into depth on this homework, because I want to keep moving. But unless people have things they want to add, it's welcome. But just to mention, include all of the notes that you see vertically. All 4 notes have come into play, and the way to break it down is to take a pencil and paper and get rid of the doubling. So you have an F here and an F here. You only need one of them, but this is the bottom. This F is below this C, and that's what matters here. So anything to add there? I just remember people getting confused with the thinking like, I have a second inversion up here, but then what is this F doing? Well, it's actually a root position chord, because the F is on the bottom. So should we jump over to 7th chords? Anything to add? Okay, I don't hear anybody, so I'm assuming you're all contentedly happy with moving on. Okay.
Let's go on.
Okay. I couldn't see your faces because I was in this other screen. So when I saw your faces all looking happy, I realized we should move on. Okay, so 7th chords. I don't know. Basically, it's all the same processes, but with one extra note. So if you can do all the other stuff in this unit, you can do 7th chords. But it's just one more thing to think about, and you're going to get used to this stacked thirds formation and an extra inversion, basically. We now have 3rd inversion because there's one more position that the notes can be formed into. I'll just say one thing and then maybe let other people jump in. Something that just I think is inherently confusing is 7th versus 7th, meaning there's the 7th chord and then there's the 7 chord, which can be a 7th chord. So it's just sort of thorny. The 7 chord with no th at the end is the Roman numeral 7. The root is the 7th note of the scale, the 7th scale degree, and it is different from a 7th chord, but it can itself be a 7th chord. And the root of the note, the root of that chord is the 7th scale degree, which can be the super the subtonic or the leading tone. And that same note can be the third of a 5/7 chord, which is a seventh chord. So it gets a little nasty with the terminology, but as long as you're on the lookout for that, hopefully you can steer your way through it. But anybody have stuff to add here? Should we look right at this homework, or are there tricks that people have for this topic? I can steer through.
Shockingly, I have another trick I can share.
That's great.
So when we're looking at inversions, let me skip over my page for a second. One thing you can do when you're looking at inversion to seventh chords is this is another trick based on the shape and the look of the pieces. If you can see my screen, C here, example C, I know is in root position because it goes line, 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 everything on lines. For these ones that are inverted, a quick way to find the root is whenever you see two notes that are a second apart, the top is the root. So in this one, I know that C is instantly the root. Here I know that E is the root. And here I know that C is the root again. Because it's always when you have two notes a step apart in the seventh chord that the top is the root. And this has to do with the fact that there are no two notes that are a second apart in a seventh chord except for the seventh and the root. Now normally in root position they're separated by a seventh, not a second, but if it's at all inverted they'll be represented as a second. So when you're looking at these shapes you can instantly, hopefully, tell what the root is.
Absolutely, and the inversion numbers as well, like when you have the second on the bottom, the figured bass numbers are again in some ways incredibly simple. Like this is the 4/2, and the 2 is below the 4 because the second is the first interval above the bass. Again, making the distinction between the bass and the root. In this case, the root is the upper note of those two notes. The bass is just whatever the bottom note is. Also, just to mention about figured bass as a side note, you'll notice the figured bass numbers always have two numbers, but there's actually a bunch of intervals in the chord. So those figured bass numbers are abbreviations, and that takes a little bit of getting used to and some memorization as well. So it's worth taking the time to do that memorization and get solid on those. But again, this is just doing the same thing as in earlier homeworks, but with a couple extra steps. Get it into root position, so figure out the inversion, get into root position so you can figure out the harmonic function within the key. So once you find the root, then what scale degree is that, and within the key, and then therefore what is the harmonic function? And then going back to Unit 3, that scale degree and harmonic function are two ways of naming the same note. So that's another way that this builds on previous units. So in a way, this unit is kind of fewer topics overall than some previous units, but just doing them again and again in different configurations. I mean, there's inversion and figuring out the root and figuring out the quality and connecting it into the key, and those are sort of the main things we're doing again and again in different ways. So, anything to add? We're not getting many questions. I feel we were commenting amongst ourselves too that just as a message, speaking to the students now, that we haven't gotten a lot of questions about this unit. So that makes us nervous, but also we don't know whether to be reassured by that or nervous about it. So either you're all just doing fantastically well and you're just sailing along in this unit, or I don't know what, but we're going to assume that's the case, and we trust you to tell us if you're struggling, because we have to rely on you to reach out when you're struggling. But we hope that by now you're comfortable with the style of the course, and you're comfortable with all these basic topics, and you're looking forward to summer, and you're probably outside in the spring weather, and who knows what you're doing. But please tell us if you're confused, because we want to we want to know that. So anything else? I'm going to stop screen sharing so you can see me.
I was thinking we could encourage everybody to try to play these on the keyboard, especially this unit. I think it can be very rewarding to hear these different types of chords, and of course by playing them, you can get familiar with them much more easily.
That's a wonderful point, and you don't have to be a quote real pianist by any stretch. Like all you have to do is be able to find the notes on the keyboard and plunk them out, and it can be such a valuable way to reinforce these topics. Because if you can find the same chord, the same inversion of a dominant seventh chord in all these different keys, and see how it's constructed, it will just lock that in your brain really well. So should we, barring any last, not a single question on Piazza that I've seen, so we're just going to assume that you guys are all triad and seventh chord ninjas. Or is there a better term than ninja? Like, I don't know.
Jedi Master.
Jedi Masters, yes. Exactly. Yeah. And also just to mention, of course, if students have concerns about any other aspect of the course, it's not over yet, and we're all here standing by to help you out. So, yeah, just a message to my sections. I'm still struggling along with grading some of the creative projects, and I do apologize, but I will get to them, I promise. Anything else? All right, I'm going to take us off the air. See you. Good night, students. It's going to rain tomorrow, so it's a good day to stay in and finish Unit 5. Good night.
Good night.